Okay, here beginneth our final exam review. We'll begin with a midterm and then continue with the three quizzes leading up to the final exam. I actually may include the extra credit questions on the New York Fed reading that was assigned. Um, we'll see. Okay, great starting place here. There's a fundamental trade off between fairness and efficiency. I sometimes feel like most or many of you are just brainwashed by the neoliberal point of view here. This is a patent lie of neoclassical economics, and it actually angers me a little bit because it's so crazy. Neoclassical economics uses utility theory of value. It was a revolution against, not an extension of, classical economics. So I think I mentioned in the annotated chapter week 7 lecture, the one annotating the text. Um, the utility theory of value has its roots in utilitarianism from Jeremy Bentham, who's kind of a character. He famously said the greatest good for the greatest number. What he realized was that if you assume that everybody has the same utility of income, which is a perfectly reasonable assumption and makes this kind of approximations that are made all of the time in economics, uh, and you assume the law of diminishing marginal utility, which is absolutely quintessential to neoclassical economics. In fact, that was the nature of the revolution, that there was diminishing marginal utility, and that was the value that was used to determine price, not a cost of production. Notably, a labor theory of value. It was not that. It was a utility theory of value based on marginalism, declining marginal utility. So, if you assume both those things, diminishing marginal utility, and that everybody has the same utility of income, then guess what? The most efficient distribution is one that is exactly equal. I've explained this several times in the past. I'll quickly do it now. Okay, rich guy has $1 million. Poor girl has $1. Okay, uh, the marginal utility of an additional dollar to the poor girl is much less than additional dollar to the rich guy. Now this is pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious from casual observation, which is the root of neoclassical and Austrian economics. It's sort of I don't want to say evil twin, but something like that. So you give a rich guy $1 million, a dollar is worth a lot less than a dollar to a poor girl. No, or whatever, a poor person, a rich person. You give $1,000 to a poor person, that means a lot more than $1,000 to the millionaire, let alone billionaire, trillionaire. So you just take that principle down the line that the richer person will always get less out of a unit of money, of income, than the poorer person. And every time you transfer income from the wealthy to the poor person, you get more utility from the exchange than if you were not to exchange it at all. So if we keep going like that, then the most efficient outcome will be when income is equal between all agents. Okay, you can no longer make society better off by making somebody else worse off at that point. Okay, quite simple. So, central to the origins of economics is the truth that as far as distribution, and that's what Chiang is talking about when he makes this false statement, distribution, um, the most efficient outcome is the equal outcome. Bam. End of story. Other than to say what they did about 90 years ago in economics, many argue, and I agree, in order to get out of this uncomfortable situation where economists would have to recommend that income be distributed equally uh, for maximum efficiency as far as distribution. And as a note, this does not affect like incentives to produce. Okay, it does not follow from this argument that an equal distribution will lead to the best productive incentives. That is a different argument. This is distribution we're talking about here, not productive incentives. So, or incentives to produce. So, what they did, make a long story short, is they said, well, you can't compare utility between agents. We don't know whether if A has an apple and B has an orange, who likes more than the other, or they don't even know how much they themselves like it more than the other. People just know, agents just know that they like something more than something else. They don't know by how much, A, and the important thing here is that the argument is that you can't make that comparison between agents. Now, that may seem reasonable for talking about apples and oranges, but then they try to extend it to somebody getting a life-saving medical treatment versus somebody getting a fifth yacht. And you can't compare that utility. The argument would be, well, even if somebody dies, that was, their death was less valuable than the person getting the new yacht, which is, it's obvious that that's not the case. People obviously have physical similarities in needs, and at least until you get to subsistence, you can make reasonable comparisons to utility. I mean, they do that all of the time. They base well-being measures on nutritional value, on quality of life, on length of life. Obviously, you can make those kind of utility comparisons. So once you use ordinal utility and you say, well, we can't compare utility, then there's no reasonable measure of aggregated utility or social welfare, okay, or aggregated welfare. Welfare and utility pretty much mean the same thing. Welfare is basically an aggregation of utility. So what they do then is they say, well, we'll have Pareto efficiency. Pareto efficiency is where nobody can be made better off with making somebody else worse off. Now, this is kind of an arbitrary definition. It's used because if you have ordinal utility, you can't, like I said, make any meaningful efficiency statements. You can only know that it is definitely more efficient if you can make everybody better off. But you don't know that's more efficient than an alternative policy that would make some people only a little bit worse off and a lot of other people much better off. E.g., if we took the fifth yacht away from the billionaire to give medical treatment to 100 people, that would save 100 lives. Okay, that would be more efficient. That's pretty obvious. But Pareto efficiency says that that's not more efficient. It's also lying, because what they call inefficiency is not inefficiency. It's at best a question mark. We don't know whether a policy that made somebody worse off and somebody else better off is inefficient. It might be more efficient. They just don't know. So they call it inefficient, and once you're calling something that you either don't know is efficient or not, or that is clearly more efficient based on, marked human physical similarity, you're just calling that inefficient when it isn't. And so once, it's at most you don't know. And once you do that, then you can say that anything that would transfer wealth from one agent to another, making one worse off and the other better off, like, for example, medical treatments for the poor at the expense of more money from the rich, then you can claim that is inefficient, even though it's not, because, like I said, at best you don't know, and likely you do know that it's more efficient, definitely based on the Benthamite equality, efficiency, consistency that I've mentioned earlier. Then you can say, oh, well, see, look, it's inefficient if it's fair, or if it's equal. If we increase fairness or equality and make the poor better off at the expense of the rich, that may be more fair, but it's not inefficient. Well, they're only saying that because they're using Pareto efficiency, and they are misrepresenting what is a question mark with this, and we don't know if it's efficient, with this assertion that it is more efficient, when in many cases, like giving wealth from the extremely wealthy to the extremely poor, is observably and sensibly more efficient. Okay, so I hope I've gotten through to you on this once and for all. Okay, so yeah, climate change. Okay. Now, one of the things that is crazy about Chiang, I mean, I'm using his textbook. Ironically, I came to this textbook by a series of accidents when I was teaching at the USDB, which is like the only prison for military prisoners in the world, in the United States military, all of them, at least those with more than 10-year sentences. So I was teaching, and they gave me this 10-year-old textbook. Didn't have much say in the matter, and it was Chiang's micro book. So then when I went to teach, eventually they got the updated versions, but because of that, they accidentally gave me this macro book. In fact, the guy, he claims he's not my boss, but who kind of was kind of like, well, why'd you get that? I was like, well, I think he got it. Wasn't my fault. So, I decided to stick with it because we got it. Now, there are actually weirdly things I like about it. One of them is he states this BS so well that it's pretty easy to take down. So one of the crazinesses in here is this idea that mitigating anthropogenic global climate change is a public good, or it's also called a positive market externality. Okay, when he talks about the shark fin consumption, he's like, this is, a social cost that's not being counted on the market. That's exactly what anthropogenic global climate change is. So to mitigate a public cost by internalizing it into the market, that's not creating a public good. Okay, it's undoing a public bad. Same with the shark's fin. It's crazy that he's saying otherwise. GDP is not reducing global climate change. There may be some reductions in the amount of carbon released per unit of GDP, but every unit of GDP increasing is increasing more and is increasing GDP more and more. For reasons I've already gone into, it's not allocatively efficient. I mean, anthropogenic global climate change is allocatively inefficient. Resources are being used for a good whose cost is greater than its benefit, because the people suffering that cost are at least 10 years out from the time of these things. Is 50 years, but it's a 10-year. 93% of global climate change occurs. It can persist for hundreds or thousands of years, or forever, like if it wipes out a species, or the polar ice caps, which are going to be gone forever. Then even if we stopped it now, what we've lost in polar ice caps, we've lost at least until the next ice age in like 1,000 years or so. So those bearing the cost are 10 years out. But if we're talking about everybody throughout time and space who are human beings as a whole, they all have standing. So by releasing carbon emissions and not paying the full cost of it, in terms of a tax, for instance, there is a greater cost than benefit to society as a whole. It would prefer more green goods, or at least goods that come at a far higher benefit than the ones that are being instead produced at benefit that is exceeded, marginal benefit that is exceeded by its marginal cost. The thing about infinite damage to future generations, we may argue, well, in how many billions of years the human race would be wiped out anyhow, and this rate we may do it with nuclear weapons, which I think, and the threat of that will get worse as global climate change increases. That's part of my research, but we just kind of assume that human generations are infinite. So even if global climate change didn't wipe out the human race, even one species, it's what I call horizontal infinity as opposed to vertical infinity. Vertical infinity would mean each generation is suffering a greater and greater loss over an infinite time period, or an infinite loss in one time period, which you might assume is happening with like the loss of human life that was otherwise preventable. In any event, one species, because if we're assuming that humans live facing an infinite time horizon in economics generally in these questions, in this argument, it's an infinite cost. Even if we calculated the cost of one species of sparrow, or sparrows, let's say, Comes from that Browning poem. God, he sees every sparrow that drops. Well, if the species dropped, then the cost of that to one generation is times infinity because there's an infinite number of generations. Let's see, yeah, consumption of the good it's greater than its market cost. AGCC is just like the shark fin in that regard. That Xiang actually is correct in discussing. Don't know why the much bigger issue drops the ball, other than economists don't like to have to deal with this kind of inconvenient truth, to quote the name of the film um, by Al Gore. But they don't like dealing with it. And this isn't just, orthodox mainstream economists. I found that heterodox economists aren't any better about this, really. It just upsets their dinner table conversation. The kind of things they've been arguing about, like what brings about growth the most, or distributing wealth to the poor. In fact, distributing wealth to the poor is worse, other things equal for the climate. So, um, they don't like to deal with it. So they're anxious to come up with any argument, no matter no matter how absurd, which essentially all of them are, to try to get out of dealing with this horrible reality of anthropogenic global climate change. Okay, markets. So originally, some of you got it, some of you missed this. Even more recently, this is actually a simple one. Two people make an exchange. Okay, nobody is going to exchange something for something else of equal value, because it wouldn't be worth the trouble of leaving your house to make the exchange, or even getting up and opening the door for somebody coming to make the exchange, or on the internet. Why would you change something from else of equal value? You definitely wouldn't exchange it for something of lesser value, and we're talking about rational agents here. So you are always exchanging anything that you exchange, whether labor for goods, one good for another good, whatever. You're exchanging it for something of greater value. You're always getting more than you're giving. That's true of both agents. Therefore, society as a whole is made better off by every exchange. Therefore, price is less than value. Simple truth that almost everybody is missing here. It's fooled like everybody, even though it's right there in Pareto's, in the Edgeworth box argument, and the what's that called? Like Pareto exchange argument. Basically the Pareto efficiency argument, which in this case of exchange makes sense. So, other things equal, exchange is always a good thing. Price is not equal to value, which something that Aristotle thought. I mean, Aristotle thought price equaled value, and he was wrong, and it led Marx to falsely arrive at the labor theory of value. It's a long story. It's a little bit different than it's a lot different than the way Smith arrived at it. And although Smith was right, he was confusing value with price, which has just caused endless confusion. I'm doing some research on it in the hopes of ending that. Okay, so moving on. This is something that was talked about. There is basically different ways we can characterize labor inputs. My own is time, energy, and space. I'll let you guys and gals think about this one. Why those would be all inputs, land and labor. That's the Austrian way of looking at it. Everything comes down to land and labor. When the first human made the first article of capital, they only had land and they only had their own labor. Now, land here is a general term for all natural resources. Okay, sunlight, fruit, heat, whatever. Okay, it's all land. It's all coming from land. Austrian. One of the things I love about the Austrians is this ontology. Land, labor, and capital is the more common one. That's kind of, we have the natural resources, we have labor, and we have what's come of those. Now, generally, if we're talking about land, labor, and capital, labor is just the actual physical labor, skills, talents, capabilities. I would, at least myself, I'll call that human capital, at least the aspects of the kind of aspects of that are kind of, I think of as added on to labor that can be added. So if you're counting human capital as capital, then it's land, labor, and capital. Now the next one, if you want to disaggregate physical and human capital, different things. We can also talk about it in terms of land, labor, physical capital, and human capital. And of course, finished consumption goods are not productive inputs. So it is not a factor of, they're not a factor of production. They're a result of production. Okay. Comparative and absolute advantage was begun by Adam Smith. Comparative advantage by another classical economist, David Ricardo. They are both arguments for free trade. I have not found any of you to understand this absolute comparative advantage that I have not met with personally. Just saying. We'll get to that at some point in this review. So obviously these other three, they're just, this is one of those easy questions. Let's go to the textbook. It's right there. I included some of those just to be nice. Let's see. Okay. So, yeah. Now this is something that actually jump ahead to chapter 13 that Chiang is kind of overlooking when he talks about aggregate supply shocks. If you look at his little graph of aggregate supply in panel B of figure 5, I don't know the page number offhand of chapter 13, figure 5, panel B. He's acting like an aggregate supply shock is something that just happens and then it just returns to normal again without bothering to say that. But anthropogenic global climate change is bringing on supply shocks that are permanent, like the coffee that's gone. It's gone pretty much forever. Okay, at least for a very long time. Definitely, even in the long run, it's not coming back again. It would be like the very, very, very long run, at best, if that. So one of the scary things about AGCC is, like that German proverb, what's gone is gone. But we're talking about for everybody, for all generations, forever. That's why this is nothing to ignore as economists keep coming up with more and more and more absurd and insane reasons to attempt to do so. And now it's kind of caught on politically. Right when, about 2006, when people had finally been unable to deny that global climate change was happening, there's a report by Nicholas Stern that revealed all the damage to GDP. There's aspects of it I don't agree with, but he was definitely saying we needed to act immediately on anthropogenic global climate change. And then about a year later, was attacked by economists, kind of a lot of BS, and I would call it holocaustic, propagandistic pseudoscience that they used to attempt to talk the world out of it. And unfortunately, it's been pretty darn effective. Okay, so I don't think we had too much trouble with this. When you guys pretty much get this. I was actually pretty happy with most of the responses here. A couple of you, I think, put E. This is, demand. The issue is a supply issue, not a demand issue. So, the supply of coffee changing is not going to change the demand for it. It will have some effects on the quantity demanded, but not on demand. I think A and B. I don't think anyone put that really that took the quiz, or which means at all. So, moving on. Yeah. So just get it. Something of lower quality replaced by something of higher quality when somebody's income increases is the income effect. Period. It's not a substitution effect, pure and simple. Okay, this one threw a lot. I kind of messed up the question a little bit, which caused some problems. But even when I righted it, I think some people got it wrong. 100% sure. But what's going on here, and you got to really think on some of these, like what's happening. Joanna likes either cream or milk with her coffee, and she won't drink one without the other. What happens to demand for milk if the price of cream goes up? You know what? Strike that. I'm confusing this with another question. I don't think we had too many problems with this one. This is like right out of the text. If the price of cream goes up, then she buys more milk and less cream because she's just as happy with each pretty much. And if milk's cheaper relative to cream, then she's going to buy more milk and less cream, which isn't explicitly mentioned in the possible answers. Okay, that's that. Substitution effect, by the way, here. coffee and cream question. Okay, so this one, no one had any real problems with this. When I kind of asked a more real world one, there's been more confusion. Just remember that quantity demanded is only something that happens if the price of the good in question changes. Period. Okay. It actually, it's not quite true. I mean, that does change as a result of demand or supply changing, but that is an effect of those things happening. It's not the same thing as it's happening. So we have to understand that if we're talking about a change in quantity demanded, it's because the price has changed. Um, and if we're talking about demand or supply, it's about something else, including the price of another good changing. But if it's the price of the good in question changing, changing quantity demanded. If it's anything else, it's changing to change in demand or supply. If it affects the demand or supply of the good. So this one, no one is getting this. Okay. The only time students are getting this if they come talk to me. I've identified the problem here, which can be looked at two ways. The problem we're having with this is the terminology. I confess it's not the best, as happens a lot in economics. So you have to, when you're learning something, change the terminology, something works in your mind. I also get the feeling that nobody looked at the PowerPoint presentation I gave you on comparative advantage, especially, or the video of that PowerPoint that was narrated. Everything was in there. I probably shouldn't, help you out at this point by going into more detail, but I'm going to. Okay, so absolute advantage means that each partner, each trading partner, each agent, each country, each entity, each player has an absolute advantage in each good. It does not mean that one has an absolute advantage over the other. What a lot of us are getting confused about, and I have too, when I'm doing this, I have to kind of go back and go, oops, that wasn't it. Like, if there's absolute advantage, it does not mean that one country has an absolute advantage over the other country. It means that each country has an absolute advantage in producing one of the two goods, period. Comparative advantage, same thing. There's no such thing as one country having a comparative advantage over another country, other than in the meaning that one country has a comparative advantage in producing one commodity and another has a comparative advantage in producing another commodity. Can a situation exist where neither country has a comparative advantage? Yes, and in the context of these analyses, then it would be if you were to chart each country each good on separate axes, one on the vertical, one on the horizontal, drew a line between them, for each country's production possibility. And if those two lines are parallel, then neither has a comparative advantage. And this is how we can know the difference. If those two lines cross, then each country has an absolute advantage. If those two lines do not cross and are not parallel, then each country has a comparative advantage in one of the two products and their production. So, to make this short and sweet, if one country is better at both, then a comparative advantage in producing each exists between the two countries. It's a question of comparative advantage. If one country can produce one thing more and the other country can produce the other thing, can produce more of the other thing, let me restate that. If one country can produce more of one thing and the other country more of the other thing, then each country has an absolute advantage in producing each commodity. And therefore, the question is one of absolute advantage. So, it's not that one that's better at both has an absolute advantage because it's absolutely better than the other one. It's that if one country is better producing both, then each country, unless the proportions of the production possibilities are equal between both countries, then it is a question of one country having a comparative advantage in one thing and not the other. Okay, so multiple choice. Now, this one caused some problems. Though, actually, but it shouldn't have. Okay, in this case, this is pretty straightforward. We know from the lecture on free capital mobility and labor, rich country imports capital, exports capital to a poor country. You have capital. What does capital need? What's its mate? Its soulmate, labor. It needs more labor. So if you put capital in a poor country, it's going to increase the demand for labor, which is going to increase the wages for labor. The more they want labor, the more employment there'll be, the more they'll pay workers. Period. End of story. Opposite in the U.S., capital leaves, then what happens? There's less demand for labor, so wages and employment fall. Now, this is Trump advances thinking in restricting trade between countries. At least I think it is. It's hard to know what goes through Trump's mind, or even Vance's exactly. But I also want to point out, as was in the video, it's also true of labor in reverse. Labor, poor workers will go to the more wealthy country. When they do that, it increases labor supply, has the same effect. It lowers wages in the wealthier country that they're entering and raises them in the ones they're leaving, other things equal, because labor supply is increasing in the wealthier country and decreasing in the less wealthy country. It's just supply and demand for labor. It's the only difference between labor and goods, really, in supply and demand. I shouldn't say the only difference, but the kind of salient difference, other things equal, is that it kind of flips on who's getting the surplus. The worker consumers are now on the bottom half of the triangle, extending from the equilibrium point to each, the extent of the triangle moving left, that area. If you take the top half is now the producers, and the bottom half the consumer workers. So, yeah. Now, this whole price thing, okay, the price thing is really complex because there's like three different things going on. I already posted about this. I'm not going to repeat it too much. I do want to emphasize that other things equal, there's no argument in which prices will not fall in the wealthier country. Okay, it's being produced more cheaply abroad. If there is comparative advantage, that will lower prices. And just from straight up trade, in terms of the goods trade, forgetting the comparative advantage or capital labor mobility argument, the prices of goods are generally cheaper in the poorer country. So as trade increases, the U.S. will be able to get cheaper goods. So as far as what happens in the poorer country, there's a lot of conflicting effects. I'm not going to argue about it, too much. Under some circumstances, it may fall. Now you'll notice I stopped. Let's see. Yeah, you wouldn't lose points if you put the wrong these two price anything for the two price answers here because it came too confusing. Though C is pretty patent. Again, this is something that Trump that is a cost of trade restriction. It's as most economists think, if Trump and Vance go through with these trade restrictions they're promising, depending, I don't know, it seems to change all the time with Trump and Vance, but with Trump, led by Trump, but I guess it's now somehow tied to threats about fentanyl from China, illegal immigrants from Mexico, whatever. But if they were to put these tariffs into place, it's likely to cause prices to rise, possibly dramatically in the U.S. A lot of economists feel that. Now, the thing is that's funny, though, is despite Trump's completely flouting environmental concerns in the United States itself to some new egregious level, his trade restrictions actually help the environment. I think I told this story at some point, so I'm probably repeating it, but I remember, I know I did, but I went to the Rice Tremonti house. The guy there was talking about, they had rebuilt it, and he was, that Trump, because of him, I'm paying, twice as much or whatever for Canadian lumber. And I'm like, yeah, that's a good thing. It's good for the environment. So, in California, we'd call that coyote from Native American mythology. Anyhow, let's move on here. Right, environmental cousins curve. I don't think I had too many problems with this. I think a lot of you are getting, if it's some sort of anti-establishment mainstream economics thing, then generally, not always, you're going to be pretty safe in taking, I guess it wouldn't be the devil's advocate, probably be the opposite, but, God's advocate in these questions. But yeah, there's a lot of problems with the EKC thing. Okay, again, and comparative advantage thing. Okay, I'm not going to say too much about this. You guys, I'm telling you, you've really got to watch my video of my PowerPoint and look at the PowerPoint itself. Probably at least watch the video to get this. The I've already explained this verbally before. You've got to first you got to figure out whether it's comparative or absolute advantage. Okay, and we know that this is comparative advantage because Ireland can produce more of both. So then you have to figure out which commodity you want to turn into a single unit, what you want to find the opportunity cost of producing. So in order to do that, you've got to take the commodity you choose. Let's say we choose potatoes. Then you have to go to Scotland, divide, get potatoes to 1. How do you get a quantity to 1? You divide it by itself. So we take 10,000 into potatoes. Then we take that number and we divide that into beef. And so what do we get? We get 10. So then we know that the opportunity cost of 1 potato is 10 pounds of beef. Then we have to do the same thing for the other country, Ireland. We have to take 1 million pounds of potatoes, divide that by 1. So we get 1 potato, and then that gives us 0.2 pounds of beef. So this is what seems to throw everybody here. It costs Scotland 10 pounds of beef to produce 1 potato. It costs Ireland 0.2 of a pound of beef to produce 1 potato. We can think of this almost like price. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's a good way to understand the answer. It's like, well, 1 pound of potatoes in Scotland, and this would be the actual price if we were using a labor theory of value, which we're not technically, which causes other problems. That's why examples have to be rigged to show that comparative advantage would make the world better off, which is an area we're not really going to go into this. But I do know that it would have to be, I do want you to know that in order to prove that countries should practice their comparative advantage, you'd have to use a rigged example. If it was not a rigged example, it might show that countries actually should not produce at their comparative advantage. It has to do with utility and labor theory of value. I won't go into this at this point in the argument, though. That's not going to change anything. So just what I'm telling you now is how to know who has a comparative advantage. It doesn't follow that each country will or should use their comparative advantage to produce, at least in its entirety. It'll usually, in reality, be some mix of using comparative advantage and producing at home. At least I believe that's the likeliest outcome, though that is an empirical question, the research on which I'm not aware of. So, where were we at? So, 1 potato, 10 pounds of beef for Scotland. 1 potato, 0.2 pounds of beef for Ireland. So you have to say, what's the lowest cost? Just treat it like a price. 1 potato costs 10 pounds of beef. In Scotland, it costs 0.2 pounds of beef in Ireland. Where is it cheaper? Ireland. Who has a comparative advantage in producing potatoes? Ireland. Who has the comparative advantage producing beef? Dead simple. Not Ireland. What's not Ireland? Via negativa here. As I said, it's very common. It's a very common problem-solving device in economics. A very common way to arrive at answers or conclusions. Scotland. Okay, if Ireland has a comparative advantage in potatoes, then Scotland has a comparative advantage in beef. If one country has a comparative advantage in one thing, if one player has a comparative advantage in one thing, the other has a comparative advantage in the other things. Bam, we're done. At least as far as knowing who has a comparative advantage, and I'm not going to expect you to know beyond that at this point. But you do got to get this. Um, okay, I'm not going to go over it again. Just this is actually a good one for you to practice on. I would go back to all these quizzes and practice on these so you understand this. It's been the biggest sticking point in this class. So I feel like I've given so much information on this and give you guys so much time to figure it out. But I've only seen progress if I've worked with some of you in person. Okay, this one here, for some reason, I think we did better on the midterm when I put it all together into one question, but on the quizzes, almost nobody got this, and I don't know why that is. So, how do you find the willingness to pay for a good? Well, you just take the price of the good and you subtract that from the willingness to pay of each agent. So, basically, uh, Jim was willing to pay $35 for that halibut, only paid 25. He has a surplus of $10. Tammy also has a surplus of $10. Hank also has a surplus of $10. So adding up all their surplus together, it's $30. So for the restaurant, it's the opposite. Okay, just remember that price is a cost to consumers and a benefit to firms. So they sold the halibut for $25, though, let's see, they were willing to sell it for 20, so they get a $5 benefit, $5 producer surplus. They get a $5 producer surplus for the chicken, and they get a $15 producer surplus for the steak. So altogether, they have a $25 producer surplus. So then the $30 aggregated consumer surplus is greater than the $25 aggregated producer surplus. So group of friends made off better. Okay, this is just, right out of the textbook, a giveaway question. Interesting, though, because I've lived in China for so long. It gave me that warm feeling all over again reading that little inset box about this. Um, Now, this one I kind of messed up on in the original question. I had to change it because I actually didn't know that finished goods could be imported into free trade zone, but somebody actually said that they could be, and I researched and I said, "Oops, they're right. I was wrong on that." So I didn't even know what a free trade zone was. I've heard about it a lot. I worked in one in Shenzhen, which is one that grew up out of it was kind of unusual growing up out of a small village right on the Hong Kong border there. Some of the students there really blew my mind. I was teaching English. I couldn't really impress them with anything. They knew everything. One of them was kind of bragging about having gone to, Washington. What's that? Red? I can't remember the name of that town where Microsoft is, because she worked for Microsoft. She got to go to Washington there and work with them. So yeah, really sophisticated, high tech students there. I stayed with a friend of mine's sister and her husband was like making big bucks doing like isometric recognition software there. Big high tech city. It's a Silicon Valley of China, Shenzhen. Um, so yeah, and I just kind of changed it to capital goods. That's where they can be imported into free trade zones, which apparently there's a lot of in the U.S. It gives us a lot of manufacturing. We're not as bad and often manufacturing as Trump implies. I mean, for one thing, I know in Ohio, whereas there's tons of manufacturing jobs and people weren't taking them because they're all fetishizing going to college. I mean, they do a lot better off, getting training to do the many, pretty high tech at this point manufacturing jobs there. You won't waste as much time in college. You won't spend as much money for college, and your wages are likely to be much better. You have college students working at Starbucks, although I guess with COVID, a lot of people retired, so a lot of those students actually had huge earnings increases by moving into the fields they're actually trained to work in. That's the theory of a finance teacher I had. I'm sure he's right. Okay, so yeah, pretty easy. Yeah, no one had too much problem with WTP question. Yep. Uh, Weather and traffic. Yep. This is something we had a lot of trouble with because it was not explicitly stated in the reasons for changing the things that what was it determined demand or whatever the word. I remember that used to be USDB class students got all bent out of shape because I didn't remember the exact word he used for. I think it's determining demand. In any event, I had originally said these are, there's other things besides those five, but then I realized, I mean, that's one way of looking at it that I think is valid. But the weather and traffic are actually consistent with one of those five. If that was the number of determinants of demand that Xiang listed, number of buyers. Weather and traffic can change the number of buyers going to an open air market, so they do have an effect on demand. I think we have pretty much got that by now. Uh, yeah, let's see. So, in terms of supply, I don't go into that as much for reasons I'd rather not go into, at least right now. That's not something I'm as interested in, but you do kind of gotta, know this. Okay, so we are done with the midterm, and we'll move on to quiz 6, which is the first post midterm quiz. Okay, so now we're into chapter 10. I'm still having a yes, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the twin of monetary policy. Um, he does a pretty good job. I mean, in chapter 13 on monetary policy, talking about philosophical differences. There is other debaters in this, but I don't think it's unreasonable to kind of consider Keynes and Friedman as the two kind of arguments. Put simply, Keynes likes fiscal policy, Friedman likes monetary policy. Monetary policy is pretty much messing around with the interest rate, which is related to the money supply. Fiscal policy is all about basically taxation on the one hand, government programs on the other hand. A lot of you did pretty good on this quiz. This is the one I got the first time I got like a perfect score, and I hadn't even had the lecture on it posted. So this person got it out of the book, and I had tutored them, but not on this. So nice job. We did a lot better on this in general. My feeling all along was that macro you're going to find to be a lot easier than micro because micro is really esoteric, theoretical. It's off in Never Neverland. I love it because I'm Peter Pan, of course, but for the rest of us, macro you can really kind of sink your teeth into. It's a lot more straightforward. But don't worry, I made quiz 8 challenging even in spite of that. But I think we'll see how you do. So, right, this is just definitional. External debt is foreign debt, internal debt's domestic debt. Okay, well, I think that's pretty straightforward. I don't think anyone had a problem with that one. Okay, something he doesn't talk a lot about. He does talk about excess capacity in the chapter, but it's a big deal in MMT, modern monetary theory, which I've had a lot of exposure to because I'm getting my PhD. In fact, that's initially one of the reasons I decided to go there from Ohio. Everyone was kind of mind blown by modern monetary theory. I did find it necessary to actually take it down in its extant form because it needs to be improved to be a little bit more specific about what actually composes excess capacity and what we want to use it for. In any event, kind of other things equal as a generality, if society has excess capacity, what does that mean? Factories unused, workers who want to work, who are in the labor force and are unemployed, although there's a lot of debate about ones out of the labor force actually wanting to work just because they gave up on seeking a job doesn't mean they don't want to work and so forth. But the salient feature here, super simple. We have capital and labor not being used, so if government starts spending money, then it will increase consumer demand, which increases the demand for products, which increases the demand for unused labor and unused capital, so it gets everything going again. I think other things equal, not super great for the environment. Why, during the COVID restrictions, we finally, for like the first time ever, met the very minimum of UN mitigation targets, and a lot of animals that we thought were extinct started coming out of hiding. It's a great time for me personally. A lot of people didn't like that COVID restriction time. I loved it. Good old Trump, on his watch, we actually finally met global climate change mitigation targets for like 1 year. 2020 made me a happy camper. So yeah, I pretty much got this. I don't think anyone really had too much trouble with this of the anyhow of the people who took the exam. Okay, so yeah. Now this transfer program one was a little different in the book. This number D, because the other three weren't really a problem. I actually gave someone this who hadn't seen the lecture because the lecture I thought was posted, but there's some technical glitch and it wasn't because the book is kind of like he makes a distinction. He's right. I'm not saying he's wrong. I just wanted to generalize beyond it between mandatory government spending and discretionary government spending. Honestly, I don't understand all of the exact differences, but essentially mandatory government spending involves some kind of an act of Congress, which is almost an act of God, turning into a law that has to be signed by the president and overridden. So SNAP programs are mandatory spending. Discretionary spending, for reasons I fully don't understand, give Congress a lot more discretion to just sort of vote directly on how things are being spent, if I'm understanding it correctly. So SNAP programs and that sort of thing are not part of discretionary spending, which is not kind of considered a fiscal policy tool. However, it is a fiscal policy tool as far as I'm concerned, because even if expansionary fiscal policy tool, because even if it were the fact that governments need to, the U.S. government has to, a law has to be passed to change it, it would still be fiscal policy. And what's interesting, and kind of Chiang doesn't go into this in enough detail, really big takeaway from this class. Okay, give money to the poor, you increase aggregate demand a lot more than if you give money to the rich. If you give money to the rich, a lot of it's going to go into a lot of. You ever seen the movie The Big Short? I love that movie. I like what's his Adam. Something he made it. He made it. Did Don't Look Up, which I thought was a really good handling of global climate change. Even though because so many people are in denial now, including on the left. Critics didn't. A lot of them didn't like it, but in any event, in this movie, there's a lot of how money can go off into sort of legalized gambling, as it were, and so it may have some direct effect ultimately on investment, but a lot of it doesn't, and it's kind of delayed and so far removed that it doesn't really go back into the economy. So a lot of that money the rich are doing are just not really changing anything. Give money to the poor, they're going to spend it. That increases demand for products. Firms see profits going up, and they produce more. Now, Lucas, I remember his first name. He was someone who's even more sort of anti-Keynesian, as a macro teacher put it, like the macroeconomics teacher I had put it in Money and Banking. Pretty big name in MMT, which has kind of fallen at this point. I think after the COVID inflation, it made them look bad because they had supported the COVID payments, and it was kind of blamed for being all this inflation. That was actually a supply shock that really caused it, but it didn't keep them from kind of being blamed. In any event, I probably at center kind of did bring them down. In any event, so when you give money to the poor, they spend more. It's a little rhyme. You give money to the poor, they spend more. So listen. Micro and macro both are consistent in this. Money to the poor increases social welfare more than giving it to the rich, for the reasons having to do with Benthamite utilitarianism. As he first pointed out, Abel Lerner kind of seconded that. At least you increase equality, you increase efficiency. So there's better distributive efficiency. However, in times of excess capacity, you give money to the poor, they spend more, and that also increases aggregate demand, which increases productivity, which pulls economies out of recessions, depressions, deep recessions, and so forth. So it has this dual positive effect. Now, as far as the environment, not good for it. And a lot of people on the left, they don't seem to get this. They somehow think helping the poor and helping future generations are consistent. They're really opposed. So, first paper I got published, and at this point the only paper I've gotten published, basically said we have to very intelligently sort of compose the economy so that we're helping the poor by using existing resources from the rich, and other resources in a way that does not either cause them to become dead or miserable, and also does not continue to use non-renewable resources. And in theory, at least, you know, basically transferring real goods from rich to the poor that are already existing would help the earth. Transferring income from the rich to the poor, other things equal, destroys the earth, because it simply means that more resources are used because the poor are going to spend more. So if we assume that everything is as if green, then yeah, you know, for the two reasons I'd mentioned, both the increase in social welfare and the increase in aggregate demand, both distributive and productive, in terms of both distributive and productive propensities, it's better to transfer to the poor. Um, I mean, there might be arguments made that that'll take away incentives of the rich because you're taking income away, but because they go on a kind of percentage basis, it's likely, I mean, giving to the poor will increase aggregate demand, and if you have excess capacity, it's going to be eating that up as they consume more and more. Okay, so yeah, I want to say though that I only uh, did not punish the person who did the answer because they had taken the this quiz before I had the lecture posted. After I had it posted, I made it clear in that lecture that this is something that is an expansionary fiscal policy tool. So if you took the quiz after that lecture, then this counted. Let's see. Okay, aggregate supply. Most of you did pretty good with this, actually. That was great. Does greening, does mitigation, it increases aggregate supply. It's spending now to earn more later. It's savings. In fact, the most controversial aspect of the economics of global climate change is the discount rate. They try to say people in the future matter less than they do now, so we don't have to care about them in terms of global climate change, which is as crazy as it is evil. I don't think I need to say much more about that at this point. But if we are zero discounting savings, then we are better off investing now, including green. There's also a lot of arguments that'll cost more in terms of GDP, and I think by extension it's growth, than to just let GDP keep growing, but that's based on discounting wrongly future generations and some other really spurious arguments uh, concerning the economic effects of global climate change. Steve Keen and Ackerman, I can't remember his first name, have both written a lot on that. Not so much on the discounting issue, but on the some of the other arguments used to try to say that the loss to GDP will be greater if we attempt to mitigate, global climate change, like back to pre-industrial levels of carbon release, and they've been very effective in arguing that. Though it's totally they're just using an absurd argument, so it's not true. Uh, you know, the benefit to future society will be much greater. And which means society as a whole by mitigating now. The costs to global climate change are, at least, like I said, one species is infinite. And we're talking about a lot of species and things a lot worse than species. We're talking about famine, drought, flood, fire, war, nuclear war. I mean, these are the kind of things that the future world is going to face if we don't do something about global climate change. So you kids should know this. Don't let them fool you here. Economists have really pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. I mean, you could argue that that loss to GDP is also infinite, but the relative, especially since we've already developed GDP so much at the expense of the Earth, the cost to the GDP loss is much less than the other costs in not mitigating GDP. Not to mention the fact that GDP will disappear at a much greater rate if global climate change is not brought down, like to pre-industrial levels, or to at least to not, take us much more above 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we're already basically doing. So we'd have to really stop right now. The sooner the better. Okay, fiscal policy, government debt. Yeah, that's a quiz. Okay. Um, right. I don't think we had too much trouble with this. For those of you who took the quiz, yeah, we have excess capacity. Raising taxes removes the incentives to produce as much, so excess capacity is not used. Same thing with cutting spending more, cutting taxes, transferring wealth to rich and poor. This is almost a repeat. A lot of the questions on several of the questions on this quiz are kind of repeats. So, right, this is right out of the book, right out of my lecture. Transferring wealth from the poor, I added, I'm not making a distinction between discretionary and mandatory spending that Chiang is. In that case, I'm not arguing that I was right to do that, him wrong not to. I just chose to simplify it more, and I probably wanted to emphasize the power of transferring wealth from rich to poor. Excuse me, COVID tax money to consumers. If you do want to end a recession, excuse me, you want to be giving money to consumers, not big banks, as has been the case before COVID. And then, of course, that made it look like it had caused this great inflation, even though it was really the supply shocks, that were the main cause of that, I believe. And then the concomitant freedom that it gives firms to start charging more. They have an excuse, and they all know they can start doing it in tandem, which means that, you have the opposite of a price war. Firms are basically acting collusively, through telepathic communication, as it were. They all know that, we have an excuse to raise prices, so that means, wink, wink, we can all raise prices. Someone in the Canadian Central Bank or someone had kind of made that point online once. I've thought that for a long time. Okay, according to neoclassical, right? Yeah, you did pretty well with this one, I think. Just that vertical line there. Aggregate supply, neoclassical theory. It's a lot more complex somewhat more complex than Chiang makes it. I mean, this is a beginning textbook. I didn't really learn about this until intermediate. You have to understand the main thing I want you to get that Chiang does not mention is that wages go up right along with prices. The fact that there's inflation, okay, prices just go up and there's no change in output, does not matter. Wages are going up right along with prices. This is neoclassical economics. Money is a veil. It doesn't matter. So this idea that, well, look, we had, expansionary fiscal policy, and in the long run, prices just went up and there's no change in output, that must be bad because there's inflation and no change of output. That is spurious. They're not. They're just kind of fudging. They're fudging the issue. They're not admitting that there's no difference when prices go up because wages go up right along with it. There's winners and losers. That's true of all the free trade that economists have loved for so long. That winners and losers thing never has never bothered them before. But there's no real difference. Helps those in debt, hurts creditors. But we're kind of talking about the man versus the little men and women. So there you go. Laffer curve, that's right out of the book. Just look at the Laffer curve. For some reason, in the learning curve, ironically, it's called curve. They changed the Laffer curve like orientation, so it's like horizontal instead of vertical. Don't understand that at all. I've never seen the Laffer curve presented that way. They're just being weird. Just ignore that. It's just like one of the McDonald's arches. You ever been to the McDonald's in Independence? They just have like one arch. It's just like that. That's all it is. Increases to maximum, decreases. The problem with the Laffer curve. Actually, that's in the reading, one of the extra credit reading assignments, the boardroom Jacobins in Reaganland that you've had. They talk about this. They just kind of asserted without any research, the people who the progenitors of the Laffer curve, like, if we lower taxes this much, we'll save $20 million. They just kind of shot off. I mean, there's no real evidence in a Laffer curve as to what the optimum tax rate would be either way. I'm sure there's been empirical research on it. Have not read it that I'm aware of. I don't know why a lot of you missed this. It was so weird. I really wanted you guys. This is why I really think some of you are just brainwashed by the neoliberal argument. It's, you think, well, this is what I've heard, and that's what on TV. And oh yeah, look, future generations will have to pay it back. It needs to be eliminated. I think it was mostly C that was like the wrong answer. Maybe it's A, but like it's kind of like you're thinking, well, that's why debt is bad. That's what I've heard. I mean, you're not reading the book. It's right there. Read what it says. Read what things say. Think about what they say. Just stop all of these voices and exogenous forces working on your brain from keeping you from the analytic truth. I was happy that at least one of you, I think one or two of you, got this right. I think there are some gender differences there, which I won't say anything further about. Actually, that's a funny story that I probably shouldn't tell. But so, functional finance, yeah, this is like kind of the root. This is like kind of a precedent of modern monetary theory at UMKC, which the book doesn't go into, but he does give a nod to functional finance, which is good. Kind of a heterodox belief. It's nice of him to include that, to have included that. So yeah, most of you got this right, which is great. Okay, done with quiz 6. Moving on to 7. 1 down, 2 to go, 3 if I try to do the thing with that New York Fed handout thing. Okay, now we have quiz number 7. Now, as of this moment, nobody has taken it. You're all enjoying Thanksgiving, which is good. I mostly want you to do that this week. You just only have this one chapter to do. So celebrate Thanksgiving, and then have the. I used to love that, like the turkey sandwiches with cranberry sauce and stuffing, and a lot of mayonnaise after Thanksgiving. It's been a while, but so enjoy those if you can, and and read your book while you're doing that. Chapter 5. So this is kind of an interesting chapter. Full confession, I learned a lot myself in this chapter. I was really I was much more interested in these kind of measures of the business cycle or predictions of them than I thought I would be. One thing I really want you to get from this, Chiang does not do a super good job of making this really clear. He talks about there's this MBR business cycle dating, then there's alternative measures. That's a terrible way of putting it. There's this NBR business cycle dating that is a report of what has happened in the past, and then there's 3 more measures that are used to predict the future. They're not alternate. They're different. One is a report. The other are predictors. Okay, it's like the difference between reading about the game in the paper the next day and going to a psychic to tell you who's going to win the game in the future. Okay, so right. That's what I'm asking here. MBR one, it takes a few months. They're reporting on the past. We'll say, well, they don't like it because it takes too long. It's not the issue. The issue is it's not supposed to be a predictor. It's just supposed to officially date the business cycles for kind of record keeping purposes. That's really what they're doing there. I'm not saying Chiang's misrepresenting how people are analyzing it, but they're kind of missing the mark here. Not the first time that's happened. Okay, and definitely not the only one. So, there were 3 others. We'll kind of get to that. The answer to this is no. The Treasury spread involves exactly 1 statistic. The difference between the 3-month and the 10-year interest rate. Normally, we expect the interest rate to be higher for what's further out because the future is more unknown, more unpredictable. So there is less demand for treasury bonds, way out into the far future. By the way, treasury bills are, I think, within 1 year, and treasury bonds are more than 1 year. I'm not sure the exact cutoff, but one's for the near future, the others for the far out future. So I normally say, yeah, people aren't as interested in buying bonds in the far out future because it's more unpredictable, which means that the interest rate is bid up because the demand for bonds has fallen, these treasury bonds. Whereas in the near future, it's better known, so there's a higher demand for bonds in the near period, driving down the interest rate. It's like, just supply and demand. Uh, if there's more demand, however, it drives down the interest rate. And like if it were a goods market, it would drive up price, but it drives down the interest rate because the more people want it, then the less interest has to be paid per person, because more people want it, so they can. It's like the interest rate basically gets bid down. Two people want the same bond, let's say at a 5% interest rate, then the person's like, well, who will take it for a 4% interest rate to choose between the two? So they'll pay a lower. They'll have to accept a lower interest rate, just like two consumers would have to accept a higher price. One of the two, if they're bidding over one good. Okay, enough said about that. So about the Treasury spread. So the Treasury spread is basically what you get with an inverted yield curve, and what that simply means is that the far future interest rate, like 10 years far out, is lower than the near term interest rate. The near future interest rate is actually higher than the further out one. So the 3-month Treasury bill is a higher interest rate than the 10-year bond. And what that means is that this greater rate for the 3-month Treasury bills comes from the fact that there's less demand for those Treasury bills, so the interest rate is rising. You can think of it as when less people want it, the interest rate has to go up to entice borrowers. So if the 3-month bill has a higher interest rate than the 10-year bond, that means there's less faith in the near future than in the far future. If you know how bonds work, if you buy a bond, then you're lending money to the company. There's different ways of doing it, but there's basically, you earn interest on the bond, and then you can sell it back, at its face value, and so when you sell it back, the company, there's bond markets. There's actually offer a class at UMKC in that if you go there. But in any event, it's an interesting topic. There's a lot you can actually say about bonds, but what really is the crux of the biscuit is that you can basically always, hedge against risk with bonds unless there's going to be a business closure. Like if the business goes bankrupt, they can't pay you the bond back. And if it's a limited liability company, then they're not going to be liable. So, they don't have anything to lose except their business by going under. So if there's less demand for bonds, what that means is that there's less confidence by investors that companies will be solvent. There's more of a feeling that they're going to go under. So if the interest rate goes up for the 3-month bills, that means there's less confidence in businesses' solvency, which means that, and this is why the Treasury spread is so interesting, it means it's basically looking at investors on the ground and what their feelings are about the future, not a bunch of economic indicators. They're all driven by human actions, but they're a little more sort of, responsive or mechanistic with the other measures. This is like purely the feeling of investors. Okay, so it's an interesting technique. Now, as to its effectiveness, like a lot of these predictors, the ones mentioned, they're really good at predicting. Some of them, at least, are good at predicting recession. They're not so good at predicting non-recessions, i.e., like we have had. Well, here's the example right here. We've had now for about 800 days an inverted yield curve. We've had the Treasury spread has been positive. The near interest rates are higher than the future ones. So that's like 2.5 years we've been going now with this prediction there's going to be this economic downturn that we're really not seeing. So go figure. Interesting. Okay, so let's see. This is a real no-brainer. I just wanted to emphasize the fact that everything that you pay money for, excuse me, all of the money that you pay for something is going to other human beings. Seems obvious. When I first had this explained by Dr. Henry May, rest in peace, about 25 years ago, it kind of blew my mind. Um, and as the text talks about, although I simplified it a little bit, it goes to income for businesses, profits. It goes to wages for workers. It goes to rent on land or capital. It's kind of like payment for capital, and it goes to the government. So um, I should say that the rent on capital thing. Let me amend that a little bit. I mean, basically, what happens with capital is it goes to profit for the firms that are manufacturing the capital, to wages for those who are making the capital, any land rent for those making the capital, it goes to government for the capital. So as I divided it, we basically have rent, profit, wages, and government in terms of government revenue from the income side. That's who it's going to when you pay for the milk, $5 glass of milk, and furthermore, uh, there is by all consumers in the aggregate. When we're talking about what I just said is the income measure of GDP. The spending or expenditure measure is that like all of the finished goods, the milk included, that are being bought are one of the expenditures. Expenditures on investment goods is another one. And then we have government spending, and that's the third. And then we have exports minus income, which I already explained in the book annotation. I'm not going to try to explain that again. And that equals the total of spending or national expenditure, which can also be summed up to get GDP. And then of course, in the accounting sheet, more or less, expenditure equals income. Bam. Okay, gross national product. Now, this is an interesting one. When I grew up, when I was growing up, it's always GNP, GNP. My old Samuelson economics books, I'm sure will say that. About the mid 90s, which is or early 90s, I guess, they started changing to GDP, and that's because everything was becoming more globalized and what citizen corporations belong to stopped really mattering very much. It really started becoming about uh, what was actually produced within domestic bounds. So that's why they switched from GNP to GDP. So obviously this is false. GDP is a measure of all that's produced within the borders of the United States, whether foreign owned or not. Okay. Yeah. So NIPA is an accounting methodology, regime of accounting, of which GDP is its most widely sort of discussed measure. And yeah, it's all of these things, A through B. We have the income method. We have domestic spending plus export spending minus import spending. And then this is kind of the formal Keynesian way of putting it. Sometimes you'll see the X minus M in parentheses. It's just, we already said consumption plus investment plus government. There's all spending here. This is a spending formula. Government expenditures, this G part of it, that's what simulates aggregate demand. Because that's what government can directly control. I mean, through taxes, it can have an influence on the C and the I, and of course, if it's tariffs we're talking about on the M, and other countries' tariffs can affect the X. But yeah, this is the sort of formal formulation of government spending, and sort of the theoretical Keynesian context forms the basis of it. We didn't get around to really studying this term. But just so you know, when you start talking about Keynesian economics, this is kind of the root of it here. This C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay, here D, it's just that's GNP, that's not GDP. Okay, so per capita income, per capita GDP. With per capita GDP, basically this is an old Malthusian thing. This is why he said that we were all doomed, because people can't stop having sex and making babies and increasing population and on a fixed amount of resources like land, because each worker can produce less than the last. Once diminishing marginal returns sets in, a sort of centerpiece of economic theory that was in the classical economists like Malthus and Ricardo, and also in neoclassical economics. Uh, you know, each new person can produce less than the last, meaning that there's less and less. That the average consumption of everybody is decreasing as population increases. Malthus is like, so, we're all going to die or something from overpopulation. Now, it's kind of like Malthus was said that people believe him, and oh no, he's wrong. And what's his name? I can't stand. Oh yeah, Sen. I'm not going to try to say his first name. Like, he's, oh well, it's not true, and oh, look, it's just the way it's being distributed. That's a problem. It's not natural. Basically because of technological innovation, like the Green Revolution, which increased agricultural productivity extremely. In fact, the guy who came up with that is credited with saving these millions of lives. I think a lot of them are babies. However, it's actually they're wrong because now environmental resources are being so horribly depleted, and anthropogenic global climate change is coming from these massive populations that Malthus is actually right. It's not keeping up with technology. Well, it's true that as countries get richer, women start getting more rights, and they don't really want to have like more than one or two babies, and even the dudes are kind of down with that once they've experienced it. Um, I do not believe as as resources get used at a greater and greater rate from economies being quote wealthier, it's going to be less than the savings. The rate that this depletion and destruction of the natural environment is happening is not going to be met by the rate of population reduction as people get wealthier. Plus, if they're getting wealthier and having less kids, they're simply everyone's consuming more, so there's lesser population, but then there has to be more consumption, which counterbalances it. And the rate of this destruction of the environment, as I said, is not going to, I do not believe, keep up with the reduction in population as the country gets wealthier. So that's not a solution in itself. Yeah, B um, is true. So A and B are true. Obviously, C is true because A is not true because A is true. Um, yeah, because GDP increases with an oil spill, then per capita GDP, which it's kind because it's holding population constant when there's an oil spill, also increases. That is the quintessential example that is used in almost every macro class to point out the weakness in GDP as a measure of welfare. There's an oil spill, more workers are hired to clean it up. There's an increase in spending on those workers, an increase in income by those workers, so GDP increases. The primary failure of GDP is simply it does not consider utility. Okay, it does not consider the utility loss from an oil spill. It's just lacking micro foundations. It's a theory that lacks the necessary micro foundational utilitarian welfare analysis. Bam, end of story. It doesn't need to be as complicated as it's been made by the critics as it has been in these alternate indexes. Now, in a sense, they're trying to get at utility, so there's been these alternate measures. It's kind of a research question, kind of interesting with Bhutan. They have their gross national happiness instead of gross national product. I don't know for sure now. I thought that this was like the first one, Daly's Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. It's a good term, and it sort of includes that idea of utility and welfare. And Daly kind of gets in a very informal context, and I haven't seen him quite apply that to AGCC yet. We read his paper, by the way. Some of us did at the beginning on the problem with macroeconomics eating micro. And he's better. He gets that micro is really about restrictions, and those micro foundations are missing in the AGCC models, and I think in a lot of ways in the other ED models, with AGCC, they're just not getting that there is this cost from to non-market goods that comes at right that is rising at the margin, which means that without mitigation, there is an optimum of growth that if we go beyond, we are causing more harm than we are good. He says we hit that in about 1980, which I sort of said intuitively. Reagan was elected, and it was just the beginning of the end of the earth because he did not. He said, well, if we've seen one tree, you've seen them all. He was so not an environmentalist, and it's just become a disease, of us parasites on this Mother Earth. But yeah, Daly got the cost, so he's kind of talking about. He actually, in discussing, I think he was actually discussing this. It was like a 2000 Scientific American article. What is it called? Like economics for us. I don't remember, but something planet. You'll probably find it if you Google Daily Scientific American article. Be one of the hits. So he kind of gets, but he got in that article that there's a rising cost, again, not in terms of GCC, but a rising cost to environmental damage that GDP creates. Duh. How about no such thing as a free lunch? How about rising marginal costs? Duh. I'm an economist. They've conveniently forgotten that when it comes to the environment because they don't give a heck about it, and so much so that they are egregiously denying the heart and soul of their own theory and micro foundations in treating at least environmental global climate change, if not other forms of ED. Happy Planet Index, yeah, that whole little box on Costa Rica. I mean, someone kind of wrote that, well, Costa Rica has a high GDP and they're better for the environment, so that's an example of environmental Cousins curve. It's not. I mean, their GDP is not that high. It's coming from autonomous factors, their choice to do that. It's not particularly GDP driven. It's just their preference for a happy planet, so they score high on the Happy Planet Index. Pure Vita is kind of the quintessence of it, as Chang points out in one of the better moments of the text. I've been to Costa Rica. Took a picture of some red-eyed tree frog, that famous amphibian, and a glass frog. You can see through its body. That the guide was saying they were both in good health, indicating a healthy rainforest. Now, my understanding of AGCC, though there's been these fires and stuff in the Amazon, is that it the least, at least temperature effect on the equator, which of course Costa Rica is approaching. Okay, so this one, I know this is a bit of a curveball, but it is there in the text. As I was saying about the problem with GDP measures, what most people are not getting is this is a very orthodox problem. GDP is just forgetting utility. It's saying that $1 is basically equal to one oodle. It's not diminishing. It's a long story. In some of the climate models, at least one of the major ones, it is considered to be diminishing. And actually, a lot of them, the framework they use includes that. But then they don't have the rising cost of AGCC, which is what they are supposed to be costing. That's the point of their integrated assessment models, IAMs, is to determine the cost of AGCC. But then it doesn't have a rising marginal cost in it. Duh. So they're not micro foundational either, because having falling marginal benefits without rising marginal costs is a free lunch, and B, non-micro foundational. You need one with the other if it's actually micro foundational. So right, GDP does not include those things. In the text it never said that it did, so that's how you know that it doesn't. He talks about how it's accounted. That is, micro foundations are not included in it. That is fundamentally why it is a poor measure of economic well-being. It's right there in orthodox economics. Micro foundations, actually from this major anti-Keynesian in the mid-70s, was one of the main arguments they used to try to bring Keynes down. Didn't really work. They may have brought down some of the economists who, like Samuelson, is one who attempted to kind of combine Keynesianism and microeconomics, the Phillips curve and stuff, which wasn't working at all. Hasn't really worked at all. Unless you count that kind of post-COVID period. In this millennium, a year or two before COVID, there was a big conference. It was like, wow, the Phillips curve isn't working. So, that may be that's consistent with taking down these kind of not post-Keynesians, because they're not post-Keynesians as a school, these kind of Keynesian neoclassical synthesis types. But my point is that in doing that, he insisted that we needed micro foundations and macro models, yet they are failing to include them like at all. One of you actually got that there's these non-priced effects, and that is the problem with GDP. It's not counting costs that are not in the market, or that are not or things that are in the market that are not substitutable with GDP and the destruction of the earth. And other areas too, like, mortality rates and this sort of thing. I mean, it kind of becomes debatable what needs to be included and what doesn't. Clean air, how happy people claim to be, those survey data can be problematic. Okay, so moving on. So time dynamic analysis, someone asked me about that. Is a good question. In microeconomics, it's usually time static. It means one time period, which actually means just time doesn't really matter. I remember, it's the economists tend to use, even in time static analysis, sort of time sequential language. I remember in an astronomy class talking about the birth of a star, the teacher was like, no, stop using the sequential language. Like, I don't know, there's whatever it is. I'm not going to try to remember. There's an atom, then it gets split, then it turns into other elements. Then it's no. It's like none of this is time sequential. Okay, it's just all kind of in this static equilibrium, as are most microeconomic phenomena. Now, in macro, there are instances like in the Ramsey model where you get time dynamism, and micro, which is supposed to be a micro macro model, but it actually again does not have a cost at the margin that is rising or at all really. So it's highly problematic, especially since they try to use that in climate damage analysis. Point being here, though, is once you get into macro, everything becomes a lot more time dynamic. When we're seeing those business cycle, the snake going up a pole, actually intended to ask you about that a question, but didn't happen. That's time dynamic. Dating the business cycle, that's time dynamic. GDP growth doesn't have to be time dynamic. You can have one time period and talk about potential growth rates within that time period based on some other phenomena like savings. But macro is usually, it's much more likely to be time dynamic, and a lot of their analysis starts involving time. Like in the long run, we're all dead, so time really starts mattering and becoming an issue. So you'll see more time dynamism in macro. That said, when I was talking about the production possibilities curve, I curve in micro, which is essentially macro. I'd argue that is kind of more of a macro phenomenon. Anyhow, it's kind of at the intersection of both, but there are definitely some time dynamic phenomena like savings. I've talked about this already in some of the other lectures, but you make investment goods, you take the resources, labor, and capital to make goods, to make more goods instead of making goods directly. So you're taking resources, you're moving inside of the production possibilities curve in this period to make machines that will make more of the good later. So you that's savings. You stop making as much of the good to make machines that will make more machines that will make the good. So in the next period or the next couple of periods, you have more goods. That's savings. Same thing as you have $100. You, instead of consuming $100 today, going out and partying, whatever, you take 10 of those dollars and save them, and then after a time period or more, you have more money. Same thing. So that's where we have time dynamism. At least that's like kind of the main way. And also technology grows over time too. We might incorporate that in time dynamic framework. So as far as the PPF, there are some questions involving time dynamism in the micro side of the class, which was the first 4 chapters. So that was just the time dynamic part about the import-export thing. Yeah, again, Chiang makes this weird statement: imports do not lead to a smaller GDP. I knew he was wrong. I actually Googled it to find out what AI had to say about it, and it said he was wrong. So, I mean, theoretically, though, it's just obvious that he is. Okay, so on to sort of the question. This is about that export-import thing. Yeah, this is kind of a little tricky to get. Was going to not kind of teach this or expect you to learn it, but I have done both at this point. So when there's no change, when spending has not increased on the whole, and all of a sudden there's more exports, and that means more of the spending is going out of the economy, and it's lowering spending as you would expect. Negative M is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. If M increases, then yes, that does, other things equal, absolutely decrease GDP. The other side of that, B here, is that it decreases income because there's less spending domestically, there's less income. I don't know where. Well, I do know. I don't know where Chiang gets off saying this. This whole tail wags the dog. We do the ideology and then lie about the economics to support it. He doesn't want people to look at C plus I plus G plus X minus M and go, oh my God, excuse me, oh my gosh, wow, imports lower our GDP. We should put up import. We should start levying importation taxes. We should start regulating trade and not having free trade. And so it's like, classical economists are pretty much pro free trade, so they don't want you thinking otherwise. So he just lies and says imports do not lead to a smaller GDP. That's just patently false. It does. It increases domestic spending, which increases domestic income. Other things equal. That popular economics caveat. If you're making a statement, imports do not lead to a smaller GDP, you're implying other things equal. Other things equal. It does lead to smaller GDP. Um, it would only not if other things weren't equal. If export spending increased, or if any other spending increased domestically, that sufficiently offset the rise in imports, which would also mean there'd be a concomitant increase in national income. Then it's true that rising imports would not lower GDP, but that's like other things aren't equal. The kind of question alone, imports do not lead to a smaller GDP, implies other things equal. It does. Okay, so here we go again with neoclassical or whatever you want to call them. I prefer the term mainstream because they're not particularly micro-foundational economics, and their lies to support their ideology. And I mean, to do it with intro students is so bad. They're just brainwashing you guys. This isn't a social science. It's a social brainwashing. You're supposed to come out loving, neoliberal economics or something. Um, so, last question. Uh, yeah, there were three predictors, okay, in the book, in that section where he's talking about the business cycle. And usually, if you may kind of infer that we're talking about the business cycle in economics and predicting it, we're really talking about predicting recessions. It's not. It's not as much about predicting the end of recessions. I don't think we have as many indicators to indicate that. We just don't. There's not that kind of information, and we can know its ending. But predicting its ending is kind of another thing. I suppose if maybe the yield curve would stop being inverted long enough during a recession, forgetting the fact that it's been inverted now, as I said, for longer than it ever has since it's been measured. It's gone on for about 2.5 years now, and we've never had an official recession. Um, Actually, I'll just say as a caveat, it's funny with the business cycle. There was a controversy. I think I mentioned this when talking about the text. I'm sure I did really, but in like 2022, there was a slowdown in growth for 2 quarters. And a lot of people said Biden was not calling it a recession and lying. But the fact is, economists apparently don't just use those two quarters of having a trough. There's other measures, and employment was good at that point, so it wasn't. It was kind of the NBER did not officially declare it a recession, so it essentially isn't one. Despite the fact that we've had an inverted yield curve for 2.5 years, I think about starting around the time that supposed recession had occurred. But I mean, we've been out of the trough now for like about the 2.5 years, and are still having this inverted yield curve. Yeah, the third millennium. Chiang doesn't mention this, but I mean, it's been really weird. A lot of the old adages about macroeconomics have no longer applied. Um, so, in any event, the NBER is reporting the past. It's nothing to do really with predicting the future. These other three are big predictors. They've all been pretty successful in predicting recessions, even though they do have a tendency to predict recessions that aren't going to happen. Hence, B. It's actually a joke that I thought was kind of cool that Chiang uses. That LEI has predicted 10 out of 7 of the last recessions, but I kind of use that, as part of the question. That's not a good thing. That means it's predicting recessions that don't happen. So in that sense, it is imperfect as a predictor. Um, yes, C is true. That's what's kind of cool about the Treasury spread is it's one indicator, and it really indicates investors' feelings about the future, whereas many or all of the other indicators are more kind of responses to things that are actually happening in the economy, like fewer sales and so forth. And so firms are then cutting back production, reducing, cutting back production and things like this. I mean, you could argue there's a psychological component to all of those things, but with the Treasury spread, it's kind of like peer inference on the part of investors. So it's really like a measure of the collective unconscious. They've tried to do those kind of measures with the internet. Those things tend to work for a while, and they kind of don't. That's my take on them. Anyhow, like I was seeing something the other day about it. That you can read it in numbers in the Bible and predict stuff, but it seems to like you can kind of get some stuff that seems right for a while, then it kind of fades out. D, yeah, that's not the case at all. The yield curve has been a great predictor. It doesn't have more. Um, I don't think the LEI is necessarily any worse than the Chicago Fed's measure, National Activity Index. So the LEI has about, like a seventh of the number of predictors as as the Chicago Fed National Activity Index. Okay, we are done with quiz number 7, chapter 5. Okay, we're now on to this gargantuan quiz number 8. I did want to say I am not going to be discussing, I do want to say now that I'm not going to be discussing the answers to the questions about the first part of the New York Federal Reserve handout, as it were. I've already, written those answers out, so I don't think there's much point in going over them. Um, that's an extra credit assignment. It's due at the end of week 8. By the time you're watching this, it should already be available to you in week 9, those answers for you studying for the final. So enough said, and this is the last thing we're going to go over. In fact, this is pretty much the end of my role in this class, other than to do grade a few papers. So depends how much extra credit you guys do, and whether you do how many of you do the last macroeconomics in the news assignment, but that's not much. So that and kind of posting the grades, adding the extra credit to it. My role is done. The rocket is it primed? Is that right? Primed and primed and ready to go. So you guys just need to light the candle and fly into outer space. Let's just delve into this last bit. So true, false. I admit, and they got a little better. There's some really weird, long, awkward questions on this quiz because I'm trying to teach as part of the quiz, and that's what I'm doing. So on some of them, you're gonna have to, what's he saying here, and what's this mean, and go through this, But you are being kind of tested on your analytic skills. I think I'm sensing some improvement in those as the semester is going on, even if it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes. But you're getting better at that, and that's really what you're learning here. So you're going to have to think on some of these, and I'm trying to, indoctrinate you with the truth to unbrainwash you from the right. I won't go on. There's some on Reddit. It's just like most economists are just so lost in their own garbage. It's almost impossible to get the truth in economics. Okay. So what we're saying here is that basically, you read Chiang, What he says is that increasing aggregate demand has these short-run positive effects. In the long run, they do nothing except lead to inflation, which is worse. But because it's actually not true, at least according to neoclassical theory, and I haven't seen too much to counter that elsewhere, other than kind of circular arguments like inflation leads to more inflation, but that still doesn't change the fact that it's all wage driven. Okay, that's why there's inflation. Wages are going up. Wages are going up. Prices are going up. So you see that little aggregate demand thing climb up the pole. It's like, oh, inflation, that must be bad. They're forgetting to tell you that wages are also going up. So it's not. It's actually good for debtors or creditors. There's no winners and losers. So if in the long run there's no negative consequences, and if, as Chiang admits, we can increase output in the short run, then we should just keep expanding every period the economy, because it'll give us these short term booms. You know, fundamentally what's going on. I'm going to write a paper about this. When I was in Bogota, this woman who I was, kind of critiquing in my presentation, writing a paper on how to pay for the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal came up with some, idiot who was lying and just tried to help these current social issues and just put the green in for people like me, the environment, and there's a lot of problems with it. The Project Drawdown, I suggest you look into that, is much better. I'm writing a paper about that as part of my diss. In fact, I've got to now change. I've already written to say I propose instead of it is, because it's a proposal and it's these crazy things. But in any event, she said I should write a paper about inflation. And I do have some insights about that. Like, people are confusing a negative supply shock with a positive aggregate demand shock. It's like, oh, if we have these aggregate demands or create more money or whatever, or you lower the interest rate, the aggregate demand bumps, it's going to cause inflation. Look at all the terrible things that have happened in the Weimar Republic and Zimbabwe and Venezuela. But all of those things were supply shocks. The Weimar Republic was paying so many resources to pay off the World War I reparations that they didn't have enough. Okay, you can print money, you cannot print money. If it wasn't inflation, there'd be shortages. Zimbabwe, same thing. They kicked all the landowners off the lands who were whites. The natives didn't really know how to farm. Huge aggregate supply shock there. Same basic thing. And they print money because government has payments to make and so forth. Yes, there's hyperinflation. That doesn't matter. Okay. The fact that it costs you more money to buy the same thing means that you're getting less. If you didn't have inflation, you would just have shortages. Venezuela, same thing. It's a supply shock there too. So, this is all this kind of aggregate demand. It's all BS. If the economy is expanding, everyone's making more money, wages are going up with inflation. It doesn't really matter. I mean, countries that are expanding, having inflation, nobody cares. Okay, because everybody has more money. There may be some losers, some winners, but this whole thing you're reading about inflation, and we skipped the chapter on inflation explicitly, although the monetary policy thing, talks about it again, so I'm getting a chance to tell you this. They're confusing a negative aggregate supply shock with a positive aggregate demand shock. Completely different. So, if you look at Chiang's argument, he's saying that increasing aggregate demand leads to these short-run positive effects. If they do, then we should always be doing them, because the long-run effects are not negative. The inflation is wages going up with prices. So, no harm, no foul, yet we're making more and more with each short-term run period. We're aggregating over time more and more gains. Remember what I said about that time static thing in micro and neoclassical? There we go. It's not, by virtue of its lack of virtue of its time staticity, it's not getting that. As time goes on, with every short-term effect, it's aggregating in the long run, and it comes to the same thing as a long-term effect. And in this case, according to Chiang himself, it's positive short-term effects that are aggregating as aggregate demand increases. What we need to be looking at as the effect on the real wage, whether the prices are happening disproportionately to wages, and you will get that drop with an aggregate supply shock. But if we're not getting that with an aggregate demand, a negative aggregate supply shock, but if we're not getting that with a positive aggregate demand shock, then that doesn't matter. Okay, and in that it increases short-run welfare, well, those add up. It's a good thing entirely. So, Chang's given no evidence for how inflation lowers the standard of living. He's implying that the real wage falls from inflation, which does not happen, according to neoclassical theory itself. And I don't think anyone's really changed that in their arguments unless the real wage is falling, and that's an effect of a supply shock. Not theoretically, and I mean, I'd probably have to do some empirical research on this, but I don't think it's really happening. Like in the late 70s, there was supposed to be this hyperinflation. There wasn't. I mean, there was a fall in the real wage because there's a supply shock. It's like standard in macro textbooks, at least it had been, to talk about, the 70s inflation coming from the oil shock. Yet economists don't seem to get that. The critics of Keynesianism insist that it was because, Keynesianism was somehow wrong and it was the aggregate demand. It was an aggregate demand phenomenon, and that's what was causing inflation. Friedman and so forth. That's just wrong. It was an aggregate supply shock. Duh. Yeah, just don't get this. Okay. So, anyhow, right. So, like his quote here that it's a bad idea to have. I mean, again, he's trying to say that we shouldn't have expansions when nothing's going on, which wasn't even the issue. The issue that he was talking about on that page was about how whether during expansions we should then turn around and contract aggregate demand, push it to the left. He doesn't even address that, and the answer would be no, according to neoclassical theory, because there's no loss to the long-term inflation because wages are going up with prices, and we get these gains, and we'd be losing additional gains by contracting the economy, other things equal. Okay, next one. This is, I'm totally spoiling this book because I seriously doubt any of you are going to read 1,000 pages of Reaganland in your lifetime. You might, but even if I did spoil it, it'll probably just whet your appetite, right? Highly recommend this tetralogy. Maybe less interesting to you. I was a kid during, in Reaganland, there's the events that were in my memory. I'll say that, even though that was the last book. So yeah, what I kind of wanted to get out of this was a couple things. Number one, I want you to understand this has changed a bit. Like, for example, inflation in Britain. Studied that in my micro class a couple years back, about a year ago, year and a half ago, was hurting the poor. But traditionally, like I said, this millennium's been kind of crazy with economics and politics. It's kind of started with the election of W. Bush right around 2000. He didn't deserve to be elected. The court just flouted justice to say that he should. He wasn't legitimately elected. Politics, economics just kind of gone crazy since this third millennium. Go figure. Or I understand a lot of religions predict that it's going to be a big problematic, I don't know, world-ending, world-changing, dramatically type millennium, and we're heading in that direction by what we're not doing about anthropogenic global climate change. However, traditionally, the left, the Democrats, whatever, they're concerned with unemployment. They want to remove unemployment. They don't care as much about inflation. The right cares about inflation. They don't care as much about unemployment. Carter, a Democrat, flipped that. I mean, even Nixon and Ford were more concerned about unemployment than inflation. Nixon had perceived with Eisenhower, he learned this lesson that you don't want to try to cause unemployment by fighting inflation. So they were even all on the left of this. It wasn't until Carter he jumped to the right, and apparently that lost him the election. Another thing I want you to get is just the terminology here: monetary dove, monetary hawk. I was trying to trick you a little bit, but by kind of burying this. But that's the whole point. Carter went from being he promised to balance the budget. I don't know if he ever was a monetary dove. He definitely left office as a monetary hawk, at least according to Reaganland here. So that's what cost him the election. Ironically, he wasn't too far to the left. He went to the right, and that apparently brought in the real right monster, Reagan. Reagan's a mixed bag. bad for the environment. Carter was a lot better, domestically, but on the other hand, he was starting all this international trade stuff, so, and deregulation and so forth. So, that wasn't too great for the environment, at least the trade stuff. And, you know, and it's actually Nixon who started the Environmental Protection Agency. Nixon's a very complex guy. I mean, what he did in Cambodia was so horrible. He's definitely in the evil column. But yeah, very magic what he did with China. And as I said, he started the EPA. Okay, enough of that. Modern monetary theory. Now, one of the reasons I was glad that Chiang talked about functional finance is that it's a precursor to modern monetary theory, which is at UMKC, which I am trying to drag into an improved analysis and improved theory. I'm trying to improve their theory. Just kind of dragging them, kicking and screaming into that, um, into this. So, functional finance. A lot of you did good on this. Is in the book. I think everybody took the quiz, got this. Oh no, wait. I'm sorry. That was. I'm confusing myself here. I had that. I had the functional finance question on the quiz 6, and I think all of you got that. This is not something that at this point any of you have taken. Um, so modern monetary theory, the point here is they're anti-Friedman. They're pro-government deficit if there's excess capacity, and they're like, there is no crowding out. We can, there's studies that show there isn't crowding out in when there's increased deficits. Well, why do you think that is? It's kind of like, duh, Friedman, the Fed actually controls the interest rate, so there's not really a danger of interest rates rising from crowding out because the Fed can always, loan, create and loan money at whatever interest rate it wants. If they get too high, it'll just bring them down. So that's kind of patently absurd what Friedman's saying about crowding out. The other things were just kind of, distractors. They're just not. I mean, there's no reason there'd be probably less foreign debt in a recession. Um, that has really nothing to do with the issue. It doesn't lower the interest rate; it raises it as far as C is concerned. Yeah, that may be true about Milton Friedman, may not be, but that would be an ad hominem argument. Even if I were to say that were true, that wouldn't be an argument. That wouldn't mean he's necessarily wrong about crowding out. You'd have to say why crowding out itself is wrong, otherwise you're engaging in the logical fallacy of ad hominem attack. And increased foreign debt and B here would lower the interest rate anyhow. That's B. Okay, so now that. So I kind of already talked about this a lot. Basically, uh, this is just untrue. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. I mean, that's not true. Prices go up if there's a negative supply shock. That's not a monetary phenomenon. The government doesn't have to print more money, and even if they did, causing a hyperinflation, that's not the real issue. So, that kind of covers A. B. That's not true for the reasons I just said. C. Yeah, I mean, this is crazy. In the 70s, every macro textbook I've come across has always been like the 70s inflation was from this oil supply shock. Yet, in the theoretical sort of discussion space, it's often like somehow, Keynes was wrong or demand management was wrong. I will say, with having thought this through more, that there may be something to what they were saying about demand was not increasing demand, was not bringing about more productivity by firms, that they needed to have a capital base and a capital formation. Again, I haven't thought that through enough. There may be something to that in the 70s, but, fundamentally there was this huge supply shock. I'll admit, about 30 years later, we had oil prices skyrocket and didn't have that kind of an effect on the economy. And the economy was definitely slowing down. Only housing. I remember reading housing is the only thing keeping us going, and then we all know where that led. So it was sort of precipitating a recession. So although it wasn't like there was stagflation. I mean, there wasn't like higher prices because of the idea being that things were a lot less oil dependent at that time. I don't know. The 70s, I admit, it does have some mysterious components to it. But I think to ignore supply shock and talking about prices going up is irresponsible. I mean, the real wage was falling. Um, so kind of what they call it post Keynesian cost push price pull was going on. As there's costs increases, every agent tries to sort of better their position, by putting costs on the other, so firms charge more. Um, People don't produce as much. They're kind of fighting over what is. I admit this is not fully developed, but there may have been something going on about lower taxes would more incentivize firms than higher public demand, and that's a tax issue. Ironically, lower taxes is a Keynesian belief. This whole supply side argument is not anti-Keynesian. So, I'm not really concluding a lot there, at least as far as the 70s. But definitely ignoring this that there was this huge supply talk in the 70s is and the issue with the capital formation was about why there wasn't employment, not about why there was inflation, um, which was an aggregate supply, not an aggregate demand phenomenon from the oil shock. Okay, yeah, this is a huge problem with D. Big issue here. Oops, and so it's kind of like with D here. It's kind of like this just keeps happening. When they're critiquing modern monetary theory and when people talk about aggregate demand stimulus and so forth and government deficit spending, they're like, oh, there's going to be this high. That's how hyperinflation occurred. It's not how hyperinflation occurred. That was just negative supply shock. Ironically, E is very common. It's like I remember a kind of neoliberal teacher I was often arguing with, kind of like he actually said that this is just a logical first principle. When I mean, throughout for the last 20 years, like after the recession, they were printing money right and left. It wasn't doing anything to prices. The Fed was getting frustrated in their absolute inability to raise prices to the level they wanted to, as hard as they tried. So obviously, you can print money and it doesn't raise prices. What happens is if you give money to the poor, it might raise prices and employment. But if you just give it to the rich, they're not. No profits is no profits. Giving them more money to invest does not incentivize them sufficiently. It just kind of stays off in monetary purgatory and doesn't really do anything. Now, as I said, that's actually good for the environment. So, complex question that is almost ubiquitously oversimplified by the left, too, is not really any better than the right at accepting the truth. Um, Moving along, so it is true that the Federal Reserve Board does want to keep pretty reasonable rate of interest as guided by Congress. That is not, however, one of the dual mandate twin goals, or the dual mandate in the New York Fed handout is called dual mandate. In Chiang Chapter 13 he calls it twin goals, but they are, Chiang kind of describes it as in terms of a growing economy, the dual mandate. And these are the two biggies in macroeconomics as far as policy are stable prices, meaning not more than about 2% a year inflation, and maximum employment, which they used to call full employment, but in order to sort of is that the word? To sort of lessen the role of the Fed in reducing employment, they call it maximum employment. It's a long story, but it's this whole idea that there's this natural rate of unemployment, or frictional unemployment, which says there can't be full employment, and so they don't have to do that. They just have to get it as high as possible. Some different wording there. So really, we have three things going on: economic growth, basically improving standard of living, reasonable, steady rate of inflation at about 2% a year, which is sort of Friedman's, and maximum employment, which used to be like full employment. But anyhow, Those are the real three things going on. However, the twin goals or the dual mandate kind of implies this kind of snake-like growth up the pole. So this snake of Asclepius, although that's on a vertical pole, and this is more like a diagonal upward slanted pole in the picture around the beginning of the chapter in Xiong, a snake going up the pole. It's kind of implied. So that's one of the three biggies. And since that's kind of, taking care of itself, as it were, one step, you know, two steps forward, one step back. Although recently the expansionary periods have been very long. We had much fewer recessions than we were used to. So yeah, sale prices and maximum employment. It's kind of, there's much more to say. Just there's sort of this problem with the way that I can write the quizzes. They won't let me use the same words. So I kind of have to come up with different ways of saying the same thing on the left here, at least. So you actually kind of struggle a lot with how to even write this first sentence or how to write the ones below. But yeah, this is from the book Fiscal Policy. Government spending is a tool of fiscal policy. The interest rate, like the main tool of monetary policy, although taxation is there too. Really, with fiscal policy, it's generally spending rather than taxation. I think that's the big one. But it's also the tax rate. It's a big thing with MMT. We should slow down the economy with taxes, not the interest rate. Doing the kind of fiscal side instead of the monetary side. They're very kind of post-Keynesian. It's debatable that they actually are, but they're kind of on the same side of the road. You'll hear, post-Keynesians say, "Well, we're not really MMT, but we're not. We're kind of we're walking this journey together. We're kind of friendly with each other." I remember one of them was writing like a friendly critique of MMT's guy's a Canadian, Lavoie. There's two Lavoies, an Austrian and this guy who's, I believe, a post-Keynesian. He was actually a fencing medalist in the Olympics, maybe even a gold medalist. Interesting guy, but I watched Ozark instead of seeing him speak at UMKC. Okay, Federal Reserve Board. That's monetary policy. They conduct open market operations. It's one of the ways to get they're kind of manipulating this and that to try to get the interest rate in this range they want to get. It's kind of reported as they're just lowering the interest rate, they're raising the interest rate, but what they're actually doing is trying to get as near that interest rate as possible with a lot of tools. One of the things that's really been kind of cool for me personally, at least teaching this class, is when I took macro, my first econ class that I completed, my first class at, no, it was my second class at Sac State. I think I took French at first. And Dr. Henry was so cool when he's like, I'd taken so many econ classes and I couldn't stand them. And Henry was like, I was like, wow, did he just say that? He's like, the first humans, we're all commies. They're all commies. That's how we started out. Disagree with that at this point. I would say communalists, which is not communism. They certainly weren't atheists, as communists are. But in fact, I probably won't mention that. But in any event, the Federal Reserve Board conducts open market operations. So it used to be real simple. It was like there's four ways the Federal Reserve Board could conduct monetary policy. It was like open market operations, selling and buying bonds. It could change the overnight rate that it lends to banks, and it could change the reserve requirements. It can use moral suasion, try to talk banks out of loaning so much. If they're trying to contract the economy, and about even 25 years ago, that moral suasion was pretty much a thing of the 50s that was gone, or something, 50s or something, But so there's really only three. But since since 2008, I was in China during all that. But I assume that's just starting then. There's just been seemingly endless new ways and means that the Federal Reserve Board now uses to conduct monetary policy. I introduced you to some of them in the first part of that New York Fed paper. You just need to get the main idea of that. But yeah, open market operations are kind of their central thing. They can sell and buy bonds, and that kind of dictates the interest rate. Treasuries are kind of unusual in this world. Some of the United States has it, others don't. They're gold. They're treated like gold used to be. They're just the gold standard. They're treated that way. Even if the government's looks like it's about to go solvent, nobody cares. They just, you bite the treasury bond and it, you can indent the gold in it, and so it lets the United States get away with a lot. We can lend money to the rest of the world at no real cost. I mean, in theory, if the Chinese decided to not to roll over and to absolutely just, cash in all of their treasuries, they would just have this huge influx of dollars. If they chose to immediately spend, give that to the population, there could be this huge import demand from the United States, which might raise prices here, though it also increase wages considerably. It's not even sure that'd be a bad thing, but I don't think that in itself has anything to be afraid of. I think there's more I wanted to say about the treasury notes being a gold standard that is not in my mind right now, but it wouldn't be anything you'd be tested on anyhow. Okay, so right, the Fed usually uses its tools like the open market operations, and then in that New York Fed article, there's some more to control the interest rate. That was pretty easy. We should know that. Okay, the Federal Reserve Board is famous for not being political. It's definitely paternalistic in global climate change, having a lower discount rate on the cost, which raises them, meaning we do more, all of a sudden is paternalistic. Although if it's the Federal Reserve Board, controlling inflation, then it's fine to be paternalistic. The reason the theory behind this, again, it's all kind of came from the fear of hyperinflation. If we don't have a Federal Reserve Board, governments will simply start, printing more money and expanding the economy to give people jobs and not care about the supposed long-term effects of inflation, which don't really exist. So, I mean, but that's a philosophy behind what's called like Federal Reserve autonomy. In that show, Yes Minister, there's some issue. They bring up some issues out of central bank. I mean, presidents try to influence the Federal Reserve Board. They can appoint the governor. I think the governors, it was saying. Well, he used the word president in the book, and I actually didn't know if he meant president, the president of the. I think he meant the president of the U.S. He appoints the governors. He appoints a chairman. Now, Carter, one of the ways that he was demonstrating his monetary hawkishness was to appoint Paul Volcker. I'd always thought that was Reagan until I read Reaganland, but that was Carter. Paul Volcker famously absolutely skyrocketed the interest rate, like double digits, to control inflation, which he eventually did, but it caused massive unemployment and misery. And people are like, we're not going to do that again. But that was so weird. That was Carter. That's what I'm saying. That is definitely the conservative path, that and the balanced budget. I mean, Carter's an interesting guy. He considered himself to not be political, but like an engineering problem solver. I'm not saying he wasn't a good guy. The poor guy, he ran into a lot of bad luck. There's a lot of times he just could not do the right thing, but he made some honest mistakes, some mistakes too. Um, Perhaps one of them is becoming a monetary hawk, but I'm not trying to spout my opinion here in that area at least. An interesting kind of factoid here. Uh, the currency of Timor-Leste. There was some kind of a communist revolution or something about, or the Indonesians had a communist government and they were trying to rebel and the U.S. backed them. I don't know the details, something like that. But there's definitely this big involvement of the U.S. in their affairs, and they may have supported their independence, which may have played into having U.S. dollar. They'd actually used Portuguese currency or a derivative of it at one point. Maybe they had their own. I think it was like they had a Portuguese one, then their own, then now they're on the dollar, and as Chiang points out, that makes them sort of, victims is the right word, but subject to U.S. monetary policy. Um, so it's a way of kind of ceding their autonomy and putting trust in the U.S. government, a lot like what they did in in Europe. And then there's these problems that Chiang talks about with trying to have the same monetary policy for all group of people. And again, he ends it by not just making it a non-issue. It's an art, not a science. That's not an argument, for having uh, the same monetary policy for different groups. You may imply that it can be done, but it doesn't deal with the issue that in Europe and the United States, there's different economic needs that are regional that are dealt with by a central bank. I mean, when there's supposedly no inflation, out in California, they're like, oh my God, prices are skyrocketing. There's supposed to not be inflation now. All these magic, you know, great deals on mostly on food and stuff are now basically leaving, and there's supposed to be no inflation. So yeah, that's a problem to have this central bank citing monetary policy for a whole collection of regions with different economic needs. I was gonna have I had a great essay question all written, but the way they let me do points on this stupid quiz just messed it all up, and I had to end up, axing it. So lucky you guys, there was gonna be an intense, rigorous essay question that you now don't have to do. So anyhow, just again, right off the pages of the book. I don't want to say too much more about that. Great picture, although, of the investor looking up expectantly at the I don't know, what do they call it now? What used to be ticker tape board, I guess, or I guess the idea was he's looking at a screen waiting for the results of the report. Not at his cell phone though. I don't know if that would be different now if that was an older picture. Probably not. So what I'm trying to the takeaway I'm trying to get at here is that Keynesians believe that monetary policy doesn't work because of this liquidity trap, which means that, and this has, it's weird. At Keynes's time, he said he hadn't seen it happen, but this has happened a lot. I mean, the interest rate's so low that nobody's really lending money. Well, I shouldn't quite say that. That may be a somewhat different phenomenon. That the interest rate's low and people are borrowing money. They're not borrowing money enough even at a zero rate. Basically, that's a little different. This is a supply side thing. This is like people aren't willing to lend money because they're going to stuff it in a mattress because the interest rate is so low. So monetary policy won't help a recession. I actually may notice here 0, 0. It's not. These were kind of supposed to be wrong at first, but there may be a way that DRE might be true, so you're not going to be penalized if you put that. Sort of funny thing I did here. Right, it's not. The Keynesians do not believe that sounds good, but they don't believe it should be used in tandem with fiscal policy. They're pretty much, at least the kind of more hardcore ones, is what we're talking about when we say Keynesians. I mean, even he uses classicals wrong. Keynesian is way too oversimplified in itself, so it's a little problematic. But yeah, it's Keynes likes fiscal policy, monetarists, Friedmanites like monetary policy. That's kind of the walkaway here. And the reason that the Keynesians give for disliking monetary policy is this liquidity trap thing, at least in their sort of profound theory. And actually, even I think Krugman did some work on this. I was coming across on the internet. And monetarists believe that deficit spending will lead to this interest rate crowding out, which is just utter nonsense. It doesn't really matter if there's a severe recession. Everybody jumps on the Keynesian way. That's why in the beginning, when I had you that question, is Keynesian gone? I mean, people like to claim that, or he got beaten by Friedman and Lucas, but he didn't. I mean, come on. When there's a recession, almost every government jumps on the deficit spending. They don't put it in the right place, forgetting the environment. They give it to the rich instead of the poor, let alone the fact they don't use that excess capacity to start greening, a chance that was really missed the last big Great Recession. Thanks, Obama. However, Margaret Thatcher was very anti-Keynesian, and she did actually manage to get the economy out of recession with out of deficit. It may have something to do with the massive sell-off she did of government assets that may have increased supply in the private sector and then increased labor demand as a result. The North Sea oil proceeds were high. They'd found North Sea oil, so they were earning money on oil exports that could be used to kind of fund government programs. But wow, her and Reagan, they really busted unions in their different kind of context. So I will say of Reagan, he was an ex-union guy, and he actually the air traffic controllers strike, when he fired the air traffic controllers for illegally striking, he actually was willing to negotiate with them a pretty good deal. Even his advisors were not happy with him, but they were being arrogant SOBs, those air traffic controllers, and they said no and wanted more, and then they just got thrashed. So it's kind of a lot on them. That was not initially, at least, Reagan's fault. Okay, yeah, this one. If you look at the box of the textbook, I have that here. Should have been opening these. These, by the way, you can check after the due date for some of these. The feedback, page 326. If you read the graph under long long-term effects of increasing the money supply, which is consistent with um, I'm not saying there's not some differences with lowering the interest rate in the long run. None of these schools, according to Chiang, disagree that it'll cause higher prices in the long run. So that's that. Yeah, what I was mentioning here, that's true. I really wanted you to get. This is one of the things I really wanted you to walk away with. Um, yeah, this is something Chiang has this little figure 5, chapter 13, panel B. He has a supply shock, but he acts like it's only a short run phenomenon. He doesn't shift the long run aggregate supply curve. If it's global climate change, like all that coffee disappearing, that is going to be a permanent or extremely long lasting supply shock. So, you know, if the supply shock, if it is, then society has less. There's not really any making up for it. Even in the short run, society, as the short run terms are aggregated, will have less. So you can play some games to mitigate it with aggregate demand. I believe that was true, but you're not gonna. I mean, it's just gonna suck. You can print more money and have inflation. You cannot print more money and have unemployment and or shortages. It's gonna hurt. It's just kind of how it's being distributed. Um, okay, yeah, this thing I myself didn't really understand what the Taylor rule is getting at. I should know that, but it's just not really research interest, or at least right. In fact, for using that in my first paper, I made this reference to it, something Taylor said, and the publisher was like, "We don't want to talk about Taylor in this heterodox publication, yada yada." He was pretty cool with me about a lot of it, so I'm not complaining. But it's just a little anecdote. So anyhow, Taylor rule is a rule. There's two approaches to central bank policy. There's a rule and a rule-based system where you have this rule you're following, you follow it no matter what, or you just say, well, we shouldn't have a rule. We should just figure it out in the moment. I was looking at this a little bit around the world. It's kind of like the Taylor rule. It's kind of reminds me of the Ramsey rule for discounting future generations. Like the rule itself, in reality, people don't like it. They'd rather have a higher discount rate for the future in the case of the Ramsey rule, which talks about how much society should save for it. So they just change it basically. And the Taylor rule, it's kind of the same thing for something else. It's like they don't want to have those high interest rates. They want to expand the economy, and the politicians and everyone kind of wants there to be employment. They don't really want to slow it down, the growth, so they actually, in effect, they tend to go beneath having interest rates lower than what the Taylor rule would suggest. But the point here is there's discretionary monetary policy and rule-based monetary policy. The Taylor rule is a rule. It is not discretionary. It is not a discretionary monetary policy philosophy. I mean, it does not imply that. It's not an example of that. Discretionary monetary policy would mean no rules. The rule-bound monetary policy is what the Taylor rule's an example of. Okay, so just kind of know that there's two approaches to monetary policy: rule-based and discretionary, and that the Taylor rule is a big one, a big rule, like the most kind of like common, I think, even around the world, the most sort of common rule, if there is one, but is not often followed because the reality is people don't want to take the punch bowl away from their voters. Even the politically autonomous Federal Reserve Board kind of gets that. Okay, yeah, just keep in mind it's lower interest rates because it's easier to borrow money, and more chance you'll get a profit. If they're lower, that stimulates aggregate demand. Higher interest rates contract it. Okay. So, right. No real effect on employment. Neoclassical long run. Although weirdly the way he presented it, they didn't even really talk about a short run. Raises nominal prices. They don't really matter because, as I said, wages go up with prices. So the real prices have not gone up. If you control for inflation with inflation, then there's no change in price. If you control for it by measuring the real wage. So yeah, one way of looking at that, you have MV, money times the velocity of money, and the velocity of money has to do with the money multiplier, which we didn't really cover. Yeah, I think I talked about that at one point. If you open a checking account, you're lending to a bank, they can take all of that money, lend to somebody else, puts that in a bank, that gets lent. The same $1,000 you put in the bank gets lent to somebody else, put in a bank, lent to somebody else. So there's now $5,000 to go on endlessly, and as long as there's excess capacity, that's getting used for, demanding goods, which creates investment, or directly for investing in goods, which creates more. So it'll, endlessly soak up excess capacity. So anyhow, MV equals P times Q. The point being that at least outside of the short run, if you increase M, you don't increase Q. You only increase P and you don't increase V because it's institutionally set. So if you ever did gig work, a lot of the time you get paid immediately. So that's a huge increase in money velocity. Not sure what that's done for the economy. A macro and micro study of gig work would be an excellent paper. If any of you want to be economists, I highly recommend doing that. For one thing, you get a lot closer to sort of the assumptions of microeconomics in there. Not to mention the macro effects, like an increasing V. It'd be good to do some good topic to do some theoretical and empirical worships on, like research on. So if you're for getting your PhD in economics, you don't know what to do for your dissertation. Well, there you go. Yeah, according to neoclassical economics, no difference at all from inflation. So the statement that Chiang makes that it lowers the standard of living, not there in social at least in neoclassical economics. I don't think that the that Friedman or the others make any real better arguments for how it's this huge problem. They're confusing a negative supply shock in the 70s and outside of that with a positive aggregate demand shock. They're confusing a negative supply shock with a positive aggregate demand shock. Gosh, it's just taking forever, isn't it? Blah blah blah. Really long stuff. What are we trying to really get at here? I think I'm kind of repeating a question we already had. So one right while I get the other right. I'm just saying it a little bit different way. Kind of guess is kind of a giveaway here that obviously I think Chiang's wrong here. Again, if there's no, just reference what I just said about long-term inflation. If there's no cost to inflation, but there's short-run benefits. There's no cost from long-run costs from increasing aggregate demand, but short-run benefits. Then it's a good thing. Higher prices don't matter with higher wages, and that kind of poll you see. He doesn't tell you that, but that's what that's really saying. He's saying wages go up with prices, so nothing really changes. So if that's true in the long run, and there's no long run costs, then in theory we can just keep pumping up aggregate demand to get its short run effects, aggregating to a long run benefit. Okay, liquidity trap was first suggested by John Maynard Keynes. Been developed since then, but it's this little article. I think it's in the Wikipedia article on the liquidity traps. Little quote by Keynes. He conceived this idea. See who gave it its inception. And finally, last, and I don't think least, is this least? I wouldn't say this is least. Least, this is like another question where I want you to really understand the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. Now, the wording here is a little tricky because it's respectively. So, like the left was fiscal policy, the right was monetary policy, and for fiscal policy, they change spending, government spending, monetary policy, interest rate targets, interest rate range targeting, which is usually just called the interest rate that they're going to change it to. I think that's monetary. Taxation is fiscal. The government, not the Federal Reserve. Open market operations are the Federal Reserve buying and selling bonds to change the money supply, which affects the interest rate. They're related. There are some differences. I think in MMT they're more about the money supply per se than the interest rate, but we're not really going to go there for this class. I think it's safe to consider increasing the money supply, and that's what we're going to do with conflate increasing the money supply with lowering interest rates. I mean, the more money there is, the cheaper it is to borrow. Okay, spending and taxation are both fiscal policy tools, so it is not fiscal policy and monetary policy, respectively. OMO, open market operations, and interest rate range targeting are both monetary policy goals, so they are not fiscal and monetary policy, and we are done. Okay, good luck on the final. All the best. It was great having you, or at least a few of you actually participated in the class. Happy holidays.